So the first one is, there is no evidence. That's it.
There is no evidence?
There is no evidence.
Or there is no evidence for God?
There is no evidence.
Because there is no evidence is a bit of a strong claim, although I do know some people who might take that, some sort of Cartesian skeptics and some emotivists indeed. In the context of the God discussion, I think it is a ridiculous claim to suggest that there is no evidence for God, but I can understand, I think, why some people would make this claim. And it has a lot to do with the fact that people fail to consider a cumulative case for the existence of God. What I mean by that is there are two forms of successful argument. I spoke a little bit about this in the event that I did with Trent Horn recently. That there are two ways in which an argument can be successful, and I forget what they're called. There is a name for them, but in essence, an argument could be successful in the sense that it makes the conclusion more probably true than false. That's one way an argument can be successful. But another way an argument can be successful is if it makes a conclusion more probably true than it was sans the argument. So a lot of people have this idea in their head that if you hear an argument for God or evidence for God, and it's hard to kind of draw a distinction there exactly, but certain teleological arguments for God's existence, like the fine-tuning argument, you might say that the constant of the strength of the strong nuclear force is evidence for God. Now, does this make God's existence more likely true than false? Does it make God more likely to exist than not exist? No. But does it make him more likely to exist than without that consideration? I think yes, at least marginally. Now, this might only increase your credence from, say, 2% to 3%. But I think that a lot of people are expecting that successful evidence must push us over the 50% boundary. It must be that this piece of evidence is only a functional piece of evidence if it manages to essentially establish God's existence or make it more likely true than not. But I think you can also get successful evidence that just slightly increases your credence, because of course if you get enough of those kinds of evidences, then even if it's only marginally pushing up your credence, it may eventually push it over 50%. But even so, this is talking about the metrics for good evidence. These are two ways that evidence can be successful. But of course you can have unsuccessful evidence or bad evidence or evidence that kind of doesn't really do anything for you. You could still consider it evidence, it's just kind of bad evidence. And so to say there's absolutely no evidence in favor of God, I think is a mistake. But I kind of understand the mindset of somebody who says that. I think what they mean to say is that they've never heard any consideration that has made them go, yeah, that establishes God's existence, in the way that they might look at a scientific explanation for something. Like you look at natural selection, you look at the evidence for natural selection, and you say, well, if we look at the fossil record, this evidence seems to establish the truth of natural selection. So there is evidence for natural selection. But of course, there's some forms of evidence for natural selection that only slightly increase our credence in it, like the vestigial traits, for example, the fact that we have a tailbone. I don't think the fact that we have a tailbone alone is enough to establish natural selection as the origin of our species, but it does marginally increase our credence. And so if we're considering that kind of evidence to be successful too, there are lots of wonderful evidences for God's existence. I just don't think they're powerful enough to push me into the plus 50% boundary.
Yeah. So there's a philosopher friend of mine, his name is Josh Rasmussen. He's got a really good distinction that he makes between having some evidence on the one hand and then having sufficient evidence on the other. So the evidence might not be sufficient on its own, like you were saying, to get you over that 50% mark or whatever percent mark you want to put it at. But you could nevertheless have some evidence that might increase your credence a little bit. Like you said, that the numbers you gave were like from 2 to 3%. And I think that that's right. You can still have some evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got sufficient evidence for the existence of God. Now, obviously, as a Christian theist, I think that the evidence is sufficient. Well, I guess that doesn't actually necessarily follow from me being a Christian theist, but I do think that the evidence, there is some evidence when taken together would get you over that mark.
Of course, not all Christians are evidentialists.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, this is something that Christopher Hitchens brought up in his debate with William Lane Craig, criticizing his claim of being an evidentialist by saying that Craig himself had said that well, there's this quote that keeps coming up by Craig. What is it he says? There's a difference between how you know something and how you show something.
Yes.
Right? He said this before. And Hitchens kind of pressed him on this point and said, look, you call yourself an evidentialist, but we have it in writing that the reason you're a Christian is because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. And even if the evidence pointed away from that, you would still favor Christianity because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. Dostoevsky said the same thing, interestingly. He wrote a letter to a friend in which he said that even if all of the evidence and all of the truth pointed away from Christ, I'd still reject the truth and put myself in with Christ, or reject the facts and put myself in with Christ, as if to say, I don't really care what the evidence says. I'm a Christian because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. Now, I don't think there's a problem with this intrinsically. If somebody wishes to live their life thinking that their metric for truth is what they feel is being spoken to in their soul, then they can go right ahead. The only reason why this kind of view gets mocked or not taken seriously is because in the context of a discussion, that is the only time you're going to see somebody arguing, well, this is why I'm a Christian and you should be too, that would be a weird thing to say. The religious experience and the witness of the Holy Spirit, whatever that means, is certainly a good reason for an individual to become a Christian. I can understand why they would do so, but it's never going to be enough to convince somebody else. So in the context of a debate or an apologetic or something like this, it would be mocked if somebody tried to put that forward as evidence. But for them, it's worth bearing in mind that they're not a Christian because of the evidence at all.
For Dr. Craig, I think he mentions that he's got like two sources of warrant. So one of the sources is the Holy Spirit, and then the other are the arguments.
Craig is certainly not as strong as Dostoevsky on that point, but he at least recognizes that there's an element and a strong element of his faith that is not based on the evidence, but rather based on the witness of the Holy Spirit.
Although, then we get into questions of like, what do we actually mean by evidence?
Quite right, because it can be personal evidence. This is why when I debate Jonathan McLatchy, which I've done twice now, he has a strong emphasis, being an evidentialist, on the public evidence. It's not just that there's good evidence for God, but there's good public evidence. There's evidence that everybody can
see, but I don't even like that distinction.
Reach. You don't?
No, because the public evidence still has to be interpreted through your own personal, your own senses and experience.
As you say, it depends on what we count as the evidence, right? Because if the evidence is
how we define the term.
If the evidence is the finely tuned constant, then observation of a finely tuned constant in the universe is publicly available. Anybody can do the observations, do the maths, and work out what the constant is. That's clearly of a different category to something like a personal religious experience. Seeing a blinding light and hearing, Cameron, why are you persecuting me? That's clearly a different kind of experience. And I think that each are going to be equally valid in a person coming to belief in God. Each is going to be, in fact, the latter is going to be more powerful, but it's going to be less useful in an apologetic scenario. And that's why you have to bear in mind when you're watching people debate that, especially for like a Christian who is debating this kind of stuff, but maybe isn't only a Christian because of the evidence, but does think there is good evidence, you have to keep in mind that there's a whole element of their faith which is not really subject to that mode of discussion.
Did you enjoy that clip? You must have done at least a little bit because you made it to the end. Well, guess what? There's more. The full conversation that clip that you just watched was taken from is available by clicking the link that just appeared on your screen. And I'll see you in the next one.